G'day guys, I'm Totally Zoo and welcome back to Wirradale Zoo. So today I am trying a few new things with the editing process of this video, so bear with me, and I always ask for feedback, but definitely if you've got any thoughts on this, please do let me know. So as you can see, we are continuing on with our Wild North America section for the Life on the Prairie part of the zoo, and we are starting off really simply just by adding a little bit more on the pathing, so a little bit of the path lining and of course some of the forest along that right hand side of the path. So since there is a bit of a change in elevation, we had to do this a little bit more manually. The copy and paste isn't quite as effective, but we copied it along and added a few manual tweaks along the way. I wanted to have a nice view as we walked along that path, and this eucalyptus tree looked really good for that. Just at the top of the path, it really grabs your attention, so I really like that. Now, something that's hard to see in the time-lapse footage is this type of thing that I like to do. So just laying out a basic idea of what the habitat might end up looking like, and just checking what the area will be and seeing if there are any major reasons that I should tweak it from what my plan is. And then I'm just going to go along and change the terrain elevation to what I see appropriate for the habitat plans. As again, you would have been able to see, this habitat will be a bison habitat. So I had a bit of inspiration strike while I was working on the red pandas, and so I decided that I didn't want to wait. I was really excited to build this, so we went straight back over to this. We're definitely not done with the Encounter China subsection of the zoo, but for the time being I really felt like jumping into this one. So we're getting started by laying out the initial view that the guests will have, and this is a nice overlook that they'll get with just some basic glass framing, and then jumping in with a few of the faux rocks to create a bit of rock surroundings of the glass. And we just end up using this one long and thin faux rock here and just copying it a few times. So a really easy trick with most of the faux rocks in the game is just to tweak their movement a little bit, and you don't need to worry about having 5 or 6 different types of rock. You can often just have the exact same one just copied several times over. So they tend to hit a part where the grain in the rock really blends in with the one that's next to it, and as you can see, I'm just spending a bit of time really marginally tweaking with that until I feel like it looks exactly the way I want it to. Give it a quick recolor and the initial view is looking really good. So I'm just placing in this Australia log. I like the way that these ones look, where they look a bit weather beaten. So obviously, given the way that the paths work in this game, we can't have the overlook without having a little bit of space in between the path and the lowered terrain. So a good way to do that is just by laying out these logs to separate that with a bit of foliage in between. And to achieve that, we're just doing the old favorite, the planted wood panels. These are super easy to place and they look really good. At the same time being pretty unassuming, because obviously we want the attention here to be on the bison and not on the plants beneath. So a little bit of work around the edges and then just connecting up the rocks from over by the prairie dog habitat, and it ends up looking like a really good viewing gallery. So a similar idea to before, we're just using the one faux rock here and playing around with that, just trying to get it to look exactly like we want before we grab a few of them and then copy and paste them across to form the whole of the wall across the back of the habitat. So there's a few reasons I've decided to switch up the editing for this video and most likely the series as well. The first one is that the editing has become an absolute nightmare with the time-lapse. I would have thought that that would actually be quite easy, but for some reason the computer just doesn't like it at all. I get all sorts of visual artifacts and it takes a long time to edit it. I have to check the rendering to see if it's correct, and then you have to go back, re-render it and put it on the slower setting, so it takes hours and hours to render. It's an absolute nightmare. I really haven't enjoyed it, so I'm hoping that this will be a bit easier on the computer. The other reason is I've already shown a few times here where I've slowed it down, and it's given me time to really highlight what I'm doing with that process. It's really difficult to show that with a time lapse when there might be something that only takes a couple of seconds to do in real time, but it's really useful and a good thing to show off. So that's the logic there. We'll see how this rendering goes for this video and in future. But if you've got any thoughts to this, if you hate it or if you love it, or if you don't really mind and you're just happy for me to do what's easiest on my end, just let me know. I'm really keen to hear the feedback on this in particular. So since we got this gradient with the path, but the habitat itself doesn't really have the gradient, I deliberately made the pillars a bit higher than they need to be, and we are just lowering sections of it at a time to make it have a small little gradient in it as well to match up. Now we're just going to be punching a hole into this part of the habitat to add a secondary view. I think having multiple views is really impactful for the realism of the zoo. It actually ends up not being that important because the guests pretty much just use the first view that they get and ignore all the future ones, but that's alright. We are looking for a more realistic zoo, even if it isn't super needed in the game. So something we talk about a lot is the fact that having 2 layers of fencing looks really good. And so particularly with a habitat like this, you want to have multiple barriers for anyone who decides that they want to try to jump in. Bison are incredibly dangerous animals, so we want to give them as many barriers to being able to get in as possible. So we're just doing a basic metal fence, and what I'm doing here is using the explore mode camera to get a bit of an idea as to what height the guests would be feeling that fence is. It can be really hard to get a proper understanding of that from the normal camera. I use this trick all the time for the fountain in the panda area, for the overhead walk of the red pandas, for buildings, even for viewing windows and things like that. It's nice to get that glimpse because it's often hard to tell otherwise. So a trick that you can't see me use in the time-lapse footage, but something that I like to use a lot. So the main inspiration behind this habitat was when I was thinking about the fact that we've got the life on the prairie section of the zoo and that it hasn't really had any proper grassland yet. And looking at the animals that I had in the list for the prairie, the main one that actually would be able to have grassland is the pronghorn, because the pronghorn doesn't tend to eat grass too much. They tend to graze from trees and that type of thing. But I wanted to have more, so the idea behind this habitat is going to be that it's a rotating habitat between the bison and the pronghorn, and they will semi-regularly shift their spots, and that allows the grass to regrow when the pronghorn are in the habitat, and so the bison get to live in a habitat with some grass as well. So back to our second viewing gallery for the habitat. Ignore the glass for now, we'll be replacing that later. But we are adding an overhead canopy here. These are the little details that I like to harp on about because they do look really good once they're in place. We'll just tie that down with some rope. The rope rungs in the game don't fit this properly, so we just have to shift the same one around a few times to get it to wrap. And now we'll add another secondary fence here, which is going to sit on the inside and just prevent the bison from getting too close to the viewing gallery. The other thing that's preventing that is the change in elevation there, but can't go wrong with a little bit of added safety. So the other thing we need to consider is that this habitat needs to be able to contain both species. So pronghorn tend to prefer to climb under barriers, whereas bison are obviously quite strong and may push them over. So we need barriers that are strong enough and high enough and also low enough to contain both species. Now, one of the big advantages from doing the editing like this is that I can do the building tip and actually show it as I do it. So I wanted to show my 3 favorite pieces of plant life that work well with most habitats, with plant life that you're putting on the side of your path, with anything in between. So the scaevola bush is the first one. As you can see, it looks great. It blends in really well. It's probably the best choice if you need just a base of some type of bush for the rest of the plant life to live amongst. This is the fig tree, and if you bury it most of the way, it's probably my favorite pure just bush. And then everyone's favorite, old reliable, is the ponytail palm. if you bury it most of the way, it looks great, and all three combined can carry you a really long way. Now, back to the habitat. We are just laying out some path lines that the bison are likely to have been walking in. So the top left corner there is where their stables and backstage area will be, so that will be well trodden, and we're just laying out fairly at random just some areas where maybe they've been walking a little more often, which will help us to establish some of the terrain for the habitat. So the second step for that process is laying down all the grass. So we're doing this in all the areas that we've laid out as places that the bison have not been walking in. And I'm just doing two different groups for the grass, one on the baseline elevation and one on the slightly elevated area. That'll just help with moving it. And when that's ready, we just put it down to the height that I feel is appropriate. Usually the buffalo grass looks better if it's slightly buried, so we do that there. And then, as you can see, we do the well-trodden area as well in grass in a separate group, and that's going to allow us to bury it slightly lower, so it's clear that that area has been trodden on a fair bit more. And revealing that is always super satisfying as you lower it down and just see those path lines emerge. I'm now clearing out an area in the grass here so that we can place in a mud pit. Most of the enrichment items in the game aren't a big deal, but things like the mud pit and the forage box and that type of thing, it's a good idea to plan around that so that you don't end up trying to squeeze it in somewhere where it doesn't really fit. So using the old path trick, which allows us to place in the mud pit without destroying all the terrain around it, and then we just want to surround that with a little bit more grass and make it look like it's blended in a bit better as well. Now, we talked about the fact that the pangolin habitat and the panda habitat, they both happen to be at the rare time where they're allowed to interact, and it also so happens that we're at the right time of season, that we have plenty of water, so all the grass is growing well, and we're allowed to put a bit of water into the habitat for these mud pits as well. So it's just full of coincidences, this zoo. It's very nice. So I didn't mind the glass as I was placing it, but once the habitat was designed around it, I really didn't like the way it looked. I wanted to have a bit more of an unimpeded view, so we tear those down and get to work with a fairly basic wooden barrier. And as you can see, we've already got the secondary fence in the background, and anyone who wants to try to jump the fence is going to have a hard time because those wires are not exactly too fun to grab a hold of. And I've just got to say, the prairie setup in the background there just looks amazing with the way that that grass is laid out. So we add a bit of mesh underneath, so hopefully no children can sneak under, and just a bit of wood with that so it looks a bit more realistic as well. So again, I think that looks really nice, but I jump into the explore mode camera and realize that that fence is far too low. So we just grab those there and we can raise it to an appropriate height. If I walk through my old zoos, I look at it and just realize how much I needed this trick back then, because there are some things that are just way off the correct scale in those. So we're just going to chuck in a couple of these feeders that we made for the Pear David's deer and a couple of little bits of enrichment, and then we can move on to building the backstage area for these guys. So for building the backstage areas, I tend to like to have a very general plan. For these guys, I think an important thing is having a double gate system and then just a really basic shelter that's going to give them somewhere to hide when it's raining or when it's really hot and that kind of thing. So a small little detail, but as you can see, the keeper's entrance is separate from this backstage area. This just means that the bison can be in their holding area when the keeper enters the habitat. Obviously, they can be incredibly dangerous animals, so we want to make sure that the keepers can be really safe when entering. So for building the shelter itself, I've used the Arctic wood panels. I tend to prefer to use panels if I can because they're a bit thinner than the normal wall alternatives. We built a really basic one here. I'll spare you some of the details with that, but just a little area for the bison to come in and have a nice little shelter when they need it. Now, you may remember from one of my earlier videos that I'm not a huge fan of building roofs. So given that this building was not aligned to the grid, it took me a bit of effort to properly get it working. but we got there eventually. And one of the important tricks to use for this is to move your material up or down by 1 pixel to avoid getting the Z fighting, which is what happens when the two materials are in the exact same position and the renderer doesn't quite know which one to pick, so it ends up bouncing back and forth and you get those weird jittery effects. So knowing that, just move it down by 1 and it can help you out a lot. So we put a little cap on top of the roof there, and we have to deal with the slightly thicker parts of the roof when we add the angled bits, because we need the grain of the wood to remain the same. We put a couple of pillars in. That gate needed a little bit of adjustments because it doesn't really make sense if it's on the opposite side of that pillar. And then throw in a few little bits of bedding for the bison, and now we've got a nice looking shelter. Now, funnily enough, given that this is Planet Zoo, the bison can't actually pathfind through those gates, so it's non-functional, but we will be able to reuse this in future, potentially even for the pronghorn coming up, so it may be functional for them. So we'll jump into our cinematics shortly. Once again, thank you very much for watching. If you've got any thoughts, let me know in the comments below. If you do enjoy these videos, I do release these weekly, so if you'd like to subscribe, we'd love to have you join. Either way, thank you very much for watching and have a good one.